Good morning. And Freilich Chanukah, last day of Chanukah. Hemshech Ayin Beis on volume 3 at the bottom of page 1384. The pages can be found, if you want to follow the text, PDF of the original Hebrew at ayinbeis.com, which really directs you to chassidusapply.com. It's all part of one website, in case you're wondering. Okay. So as I said, I wanted to review it all again. I went back to where the subject matter began, and we're going back now to page 1352. We're now on page 1388. So we're talking about a good 36 pages. So let me sum up. I think it'll be helpful to understand the context and then zero in and drill down where we are right now. Remember, the story of Ayin Beis is the theme of interface. The interface between divine and existence. The interface between transcendence and survival, if you wish. Transcendence and immanence. In the language of Chassidus, the divine that's beyond existence and the divine energy within existence, sometimes referred to as Sevav Kalam and Olamala Kalam, Makif, Pnimi, Igulim, Yesher, many words for it. Oir HaBligvul, the infinite light, the finite light. And this has been discussed from the beginning of Ayin Beis. We're going back literally from page 1. Now we're on page 1388. So we're talking about 1,388 pages, where the Rebbe Rashab, in this most eloquent and comprehensive way, collects from all different places of Chassidus, but he more than just collects, turns it into this blueprint of how we create this interface. And it's not a simple matter because we're talking about interfacing between two diametric opposites, the finite and the infinite, the creator and the creation, even beyond infinite, that which is completely non-existential and existence. So in that context, there are two main key ways of creating interface. One is the higher level comes down to a lower level, or the lower level goes up to the higher level. Like the example Chassidus brings, when two people, one is on top of a mountain and the other person is below on the bottom of the mountain, there are two ways for them to meet. Either the one on top of the mountain goes down, or the one on the bottom goes up. But ultimately, you actually need both, because in a proper interface, you want it to be on the terms of both that which is above and that which is below. And that's why you really have a joining of Momayl Lamata, from the top down and the bottom up. In Avodah, that's the difference in Torah and Tefillah. Study of Torah is the wisdom of God that was given to us, Matan Torah, as a gift from above. And God brought it down and transmitted his wisdom and his will into a book called Torah. We would never have figured it out on our own. So it couldn't come from the bottom up. Yes, we made a container for it. We made a keli. We prepared ourselves to receive it. But still, the teacher has to give it to the student, so to speak. Tefillah is the other way around. The student, the one below, initiates. When you have a need, you cry out to God for your needs. That's what prayer is. So prayer is generated and initiated from below. So these are two of the main pillars in Judaism in general. One is more the divine reaching to us, and then there's us reaching to the divine. And you need both, and they're both complement each other, and they also overlap in many ways, because Tefillah too has elements of drawing down, but primarily it's like in the dream of Yaakov, Jacob's ladder, where the ladder is standing on the ground, Sulam Mutzavatzu V'Reishim Magia Shemaima, and the top of the ladder reaching up to heaven. That's the metaphor for prayer. And Torah is, as I said, the drawing down from the top down, or the two different interpretations, which we say every day in Ashrei, which means can be interpreted from the top down, that Mimcha, the level of Remamus, of Keser, of transcendence, of the Ayin of Keser, that, like we've been learning, is drawn down into the spheres, into existence, or from the bottom up, that Elikai HaMelech, the divine king, Elikai, your king, the God, your king, is elevating up and being exalted through Reimamus from the top, from the bottom up. So this was a central theme in Ayin Beis, especially in the beginning and the end of volume 1, all the way going through volume 2, and ultimately concluding the first interpretation from the bottom up in volume 3. Then he began on page 1350, literally 2 pages before this discussion, on 13 Aleph Shin Nun. The Rebbe Rasha began, Uma'ata Sarach Lahav Inyan HaTeirah, which is Amshachem Almayla Mata. Because Torah, as again, to repeat what I said, Torah is God giving us His blueprint. It's not just our effort. And as such, Torah allows us to have access to God's mind and God's intentions and plan and will and everything that comes with that. So in understanding what Torah is, when Torah is called Torah Oir, a Torah of light, because it illuminates. In a dark world like ours, where we don't have clarity of what's the right direction and how to live your life, the Torah provides that clarity. Torah's Chaim, Hera B'Chaim. The most repeated statement by the Rebbe in all his talks was that Torah is from the word Hera, directive, guidance, instructions, like life's operator's manual. So just like you're riding on a dark road and you don't have light, you won't know where to go. What's the right place to go? What's the wrong place to go? What should you do and what should you avoid? So the Torah provides that clarity. And that's the Torah. That's all the mitzvahs of the Torah, the do's and don'ts. Do this and don't do that. That was given to us. Some of it can be understood by the human mind, meaning we would have come to it even without the Torah being given, things like modesty, ethics, kindness, virtue. But much of it comes from above. Now, the Torah too, just like when I said from the bottom up, also has to be integrated into our beings. It's not just that God gives us the Torah on a silver platter, and that's it. We have to work in understanding the Torah. So we're partners. Even there's an interface. So it's not just a gift from above. It is a gift from above, but also the recipient, the student, has to work hard at understanding what this Torah is. So he explained that the Torah itself divides into 3 general categories. We'll start with 2, and then we'll break it into 3. The written Torah, which is Mikra. This is what we call Torah Shebiksav, 24 volumes, Sifrei Kodesh, 24 books, the 5 books of Chumash, and then the rest is the Nevi'im and the Ksuvim, Tanakh, what we call Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, which was also given to Moses on Mount Sinai as an interpretation, Torah b'pirushani, in the words of the Rambam. The Torah was given with its explanation. It wasn't just given the way it's written, it was given with the explanation of each verse, breaking down each verse and what it means, and the different ways you can interpret it, and the Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah Nidreshes Behem, the 13 methodologies that we say every morning right before Haidu. 13 different methodologies of how we interpret Torah. It's a whole process. As we learned earlier, that when Moshe Rabbeinu was on Mount Sinai, he heard from Hashem interpretations, 49 interpretations of a verse like this, that it's not pure, Tameh, and 49 interpretations that it is pure. And he asked Hashem, so which one is it? So Hashem said, that's up to you. You have to now, with your colleagues, discuss it, argue about it, dialogue, and come to a clarity, and you follow the consensus. So we see that we are involved in the process of the development of Torah. So it's correct to say there's certain things in Torah that's not up to us. We cannot change or add or subtract any mitzvah and any, even an iota, a detail, a nuance in the Torah, but interpreting it and what it means and how you apply it, that's open for much interpretation. And that's where the Torah Sheba'al Peh comes in. In Torah Sheba'al Peh itself, we have the 2 levels, Mishnah and Gemara, or Mishnah and Talmud. So the written Torah is Mikra. Mishnah and Talmud are 2 parts of the oral Torah. And what's the difference between the 2? I'm summing up again these last 36 pages. It's not exactly 36 pages. I'll soon. Some of it begins a little afterwards. As I said, the Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud actually begins a little later if you want to actually know the pages, on page 1364. But it began in 1352. That what is the difference between Mishnah and Talmud? That Mishnah retains and has the quality of clarity as it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. So when Moshe heard from Hashem, from God, the Torah, the written Torah, he also heard explanations, the oral Torah, which was not written down. He passed that on to his students, meaning the whole generation, and then they would discuss Torah. That's what they did. So all this was given from above, but part of it was not just what the written Torah, that's not changeable, but the interpretation of it, that is left for interpretation. There's 49 opinions like this, 49 ways to interpret like that, different ways of different ways of understanding, or also furthermore, not just understanding, different facets. So this was all part of the clarity that was passed on generation to generation, both the written Torah and its oral interpretation, all the way till the generation of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. And that in the language of Kabbalah, Chassidus, that the Eir HaChachma Ilah, the higher supernal wisdom of the divine, in Torah, radiated and illuminated the lower wisdom of the oral Torah, as was understood by these great sages, generation to generation. Since it was being forgotten, so Rabbeinu HaKadosh and his colleagues determined that now is the time to write down the oral Torah, and that's the Mishnah. So the Mishnah has in it a clarity that shines in it from the Mikra, that there was a certain powerful clarity that they had. Then comes the next stage. The next stage, he says, once that Chochmei Law was concealed, and remember, the Mishnah is written more or less at the time of the end of the Second Temple. But was, I said, passed on generation to generation, like he said, like a flame lighting another flame, with that clarity. Well, then came a new stage in history where the wisdom of the divine became more concealed. And as it became more concealed, now what do you do now? Not everybody was able to look into a Mishnah and see the clarity that was shining in it from the Mikra, from the written Torah, in the oral Torah. So that came the next generation of the Talmudic sages, what we call the Amoraim, and they developed what we have now, the body of Talmud. The Mishnah is relatively short. So the Mishnah is necessary to have clarity in the verses of what is a mitzvah exactly, because in the written Torah alone, it's too cryptic or too brief. The Talmud develops further, and here they use their minds a lot more. Mishnah was what was passed on to them. So they also discussed it, and they also had ways, went back and forth, the different approaches to understanding the Torah. But now the mind came much more into play, because what the next level of sages they did was trying to understand and debate through questions and answers and arguments and counter-arguments to achieve that clarity that existed before, but now they have to do it through a state of darkness because they don't have that clarity shining from above. So here in Torah itself, you see not just that it's being given from above, you also see the involvement of the human mind. Of course, of very exalted and elevated, lofty minds like the Amoraim. They were great people, but they would have to contend with things that were not clear. And that's what the Talmud does. It clarifies the points in the Mishnah, which in turn clarify that which says in the Mikra, and in doing so, they achieve a level, and that's what he emphasizes, a level of Chachma that's even deeper than the revealed Chachma in the written Torah and in the Mishnah. They reach the superconscious, what we call in the Ayin of Kesser, because through their struggle, they have to go back to the source in a deeper way of understanding it. This doesn't mean that necessarily they have more clarity than the generations before, because like we said, there's clarity where you see something as if you're seeing it with your own eyes. There's a clarity where you understand it. You don't see it with your own eyes, but you can understand something. Like he said, Chacham Adav Minavi, a wise person has a quality over a prophet, because the prophet can only see what he sees. That which is beyond him is not, he can't see God and live, like he said. But a Chacham is not seeing it with his own eyes. A Chacham is seeing it with the eyes of his mind. It's intellectual eyes. And that allows you to go into a place that visualization cannot reach, at least today. And that's what the Talmud achieves. So now, in comparing the two, Talmud and the Torah before that, meaning the Mishnah and the Mikra, basically is the difference between the Mashpia and the Makabel. The Torah that was given at Sinai and was passed on from generation to generation is compared, generally speaking, we're not talking now the specifics, like the sun. God is shining a light from the top down. That's a Mashpia. So God's wisdom being conveyed to us. Talmud is the process of Levana. This is the Makabel. This is the student trying to understand what the teacher is saying. So in a sense, you can say the following, that these are the two, the written Torah and the Talmud is like the two luminaries, the sun and the moon. And Mishnah, we began to learn, is compared to the luminous stone. Why? Because a Mishnah is also Makabel. It's also receiving from the written Torah. But there's a clarity that's shining. When you look at a luminous stone, we learned, a stone that's shining, a glowing stone, is actually, it's just carrying the light of the sun or the stars. That's now been manifest within the stone. So that's an example for the Mishnah, because that's a clarity and a light that shines within the stone. It's the light of the Torah Shebiksav, of the sun, that's entering into the stone, into the Mishnah. Talmud, there's darkness. It's like at night. So now it's not a glowing stone. It needs to illuminate the dark night, and that's the Makabel of the Levana. So it does have light within it, but that light cannot emerge until it receives from the sun, but receives the sun through an effort. And that's the effort of the sages who struggle and try to understand the meaning of it. The stone doesn't have to struggle. It's glowing. It's basically an extension of the sun, not with the same intensity, obviously, but it shines. And that's why also the stone is not a luminary, because it's not initiating anything. The stone is just a recipient. Like the Mishnah was a recipient from generation to generation, receiving the light of Torah that was given at Matan Torah. Whereas Talmud is a process that the sages themselves, with their seichel, like he called it, the words that he used were with the koyach atzmai, shalom makabel, she'erev b'koyach atzmai shalom makabel. This is coming initiated from the effort of the students, meaning the students, the sages of the Talmud, and they are initiating and they are generating this energy. And that's a very different type of energy. It's an energy that's being generated from the bottom up. Whereas a stone is essentially an extension and a continuation of the light of the sun or the stars. That's how I would explain how he's discussing this whole idea. Now, where it's a little confusing is because we learned that these three, the moon, the stone, the luminous stone, and the eyesight, are like Talmud, Mishnah, and Mikra. So that we'll talk about that when we get to the vision. Right now, we would say that there's two luminaries. One is a luminary that shines from the top down. One is a luminary that shines from the bottom up, which is like the moon, Malchus. And that's the difference between Mikra, or it could say Torah Shebiksav and Mishnah in general, and Talmud, which is from the bottom up. The difference is that Mishnah is like the luminous stone because it acquires and assumes the properties of the light of the sun, obviously in a much more minimal way, but it still assumes those properties, and therefore it itself is not necessarily luminary because it's not initiating, because it's receiving. Whereas the Talmud is being initiated by the students and their minds trying to understand, and that's why the real light in the night is the night of the moon, even though the luminous stone could also shine at night, like he mentioned earlier, but that's more of a glow that remains from the sun. It doesn't really have that power of piercing the light as much as the moon does. This is not stated explicitly, but I'm just adding just to make it more, to round it out and understanding what he's saying here. So that sums up where we are right now on page 1388. I hope that helped understand the context. And then I'm going to go over what we learned yesterday. So after explaining the process that what happens that when down below, in a lower level, you're able to appreciate a deeper wonder of the divine, even though we don't see it. In other words, we don't have that clarity like Ur has. Light has clarity, but we have an awareness. And it's only in this world that we could find an awareness of the divine essence that was able to create a world that is not a reflection of godliness. That has to come from a deeper place, like we learned. So even though it's not Riyah Samahus, like Atzilus, but in Beriyah, we can achieve a certain level in Beriyah's Talmud that cannot be achieved, that is not as, that Atzilus doesn't access that level. And that's the level like he called the Ayin of Kesser. Or in the way he finally concluded in the paragraph on page 1388, says in the root, this is the difference. There's Atzmus, there's the Oyer, the light of Atzmus, Oyer Ein Sof, and there's the creation, the Yesh. So all three are necessary. Atzmus is obviously the creator. The creative power is only in Atzmus. Nothing else has the power. Hu levade bi'acholte. He's the only one that can create something new, a Yesh. The light is the energy, the instrument God uses that reflects. And then the creation itself reveals the etzem. So even though it's the instrument, the light that's doing that is carrying the power of creation, but how do you see the power of creation? In the Oyer, it's Behelam. You see it only when you actually see a Yesh Ma'ayin. And the same thing is with Kesser and Chachma. Chachma Gluya, God created the world with wisdom and design. So you see a certain revealed element of godliness. However, Chachma is not a creator. Chachma is only an instrument of creation, like Oyer. When you see the creation of Beriyah, and that's why David HaMelech praised God with simple things, physical things, not with what was going on in Atzilus on the spiritual level, the tall mountains, the design of this universe, that there it reveals the ayin of Kesser, which is the creative power that travels through Chachma into Malchus and into creation. That's how he explained at the end of the last paragraph. Okay. Then came the next part, which is the next paragraph, which we began to learn, and I'll sum it up now. So then he goes from that, that's all about the moon. That's all from the bottom up. Then comes something in between. It's not quite the sun, but it's also not the moon. What is it? It's the luminous stone. So it's carrying, it's an extension of sunlight, obviously not with the same brightness. And he says that's Malchus of Yetzirah, and that's Mishnah. Like we said, Mishnah carries the clarity of the light of Torah. So it's not an Atzmei, it's not its own light, because it's coming from Torah Shebiksav, from the written Torah. But it assumes it. It assumes and acquires that light. So it's like Mishnah, because on one hand it's bright. The halachas of Mishnah are the Gili of Eira Chachma. This is what we learn, Atzmus of Chagas, of Atzilus, the core of Chagas, because that's the Midas, the divine attributes that tell us what is right, what is Chesed, what is Gvura, what is the right path, what is not the right path, as he explained earlier at length. What does Mishnah do? In the written Torah itself, you can't always have clarity exactly the details of a mitzvah. So Mishnah clarifies that. And it gives us the midas within Chachma. Chachma and Mikra is Chabad itself, pure Chabad. And that's why it remains really beyond us. Mishnah applies Chabad into a relationship with existence, which means a relationship with how we're supposed to actually behave. Like he said, what is kosher, what's not kosher, what makes a carbon pure, what's impure, what's allowed, what you can elevate, what you can't elevate. But he said, Isser v'heter, permitted and prohibited. That's what the Mishnah does. It spells it all out. So it's light, Gili Chagas, and Shaychus al-Eimus. That's why it can be revealed. Whereas Chabad of Mikra, of Teresh B'Ksav, is concealed fundamentally. The same thing with Chabad in the Talmud, which is also Chabad, but it's a Chabad that comes from the bottom up, meaning from through the sages. That is concealed, and it's not revealed. It's not like a luminous stone. That's like the night. But Chagas comes revealed, and that's the Gili and Elam HaYetzirah, and that's Kemoshel Even Tev She'er Meir Be'Begili. That's like the example of the bright stone, the luminous stone, that the light radiates it in a revealed way, and that's the light of the sun or the stars. In the parentheses, he said that there are two types of stones. There's stones that shine all the time. There's flickering stones. in other places explains the difference between Shayim and Yashba. These were two stones in the Choshen. So one was a luminous stone that shined, Yashar, and one was more like the flickering stars that. So therefore, in that itself, there are changes, which you have to say in Mishnah 2, you have both elements. And that is what the Mishnah is. So it's not a light that's being generated from the bottom up, which is what Talmud is. From the darkness, we're coming to light. Here it's a light that's extending in some way, transmitting the light of the sun of Torah through Mishnah. That's what he said so far. Okay. The only thing that I would add is that back a few pages back that I cited before, he adds that even though it's not a atzmi in the stone never becomes a luminary like the moon does. The moon is a luminary. The stone, on the other hand, it does become one with the stone. It's not like a separate thing. The stone is not just like a mirror. The stone's properties allow it to retain that light of the sun. And that's why it glows. So the Mishnah does retain it in that sense. On the other hand, the moon's power is one that is actually a luminary. It's a luminary, the second luminary, the one that illuminates at night. So even though on one hand, the moon does not shine on its own without the sun, and the stone does, but like we learned, that's because the moon on its own is dark, even though there's a light in it, but the only way for that light to be generated and triggered is through the light of the sun. We learned actually there are two opinions there. Is it the light of the moon that's triggered through the light of the sun, or is it the light of the sun that's traveling through the moon and the shift changes and becomes moonlight, but it's still the sun? We learned both approaches back on page, let me just share it with you where that is, because it's quite relevant as well. We said that on, here we are. One minute. I want to just see myself inside. Oh, it was earlier. Oh, maybe I think Aleph Shinun Gimel. I recall correctly. Yeah. Page 1353. So it has both elements. So regardless, there it doesn't have that. So in other words, it has an element of coming from the bottom up, as I explained. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, I'll stop for questions. I just wanted to elaborate more to give it more body. If not, we will continue reading inside and develop this further in understanding the difference between Mishnah and Talmud. But keep in mind that the key thing to know is the interface, that we need to have both elements. Something that comes from the light from above, but also a light that's generated from within. So when we're learning Torah, when you and I are sitting and learning, whatever it is we're learning, it's always a combination. You're learning the ideas and the words that were given to us, but you're using your mind to internalize it, to understand it and comprehend it. So you're really combining basically moonlight and sunlight in that process. Mishnah plays an intermediary role in the sense that the Mishnah is the bridge between the written Torah and the Talmud that comes through our study and learning. But essentially, that's what Torah is. So bottom line is, when a person is exerting themselves and toiling in studying and trying to understand Torah, they are bringing the light and clarity that was concealed into a place of darkness and illuminating the night, with night referring to here a place where we don't have the clarity until we learn and understand the ideas in the Torah. Does anybody want to ask anything about what I've said till now? Please do. Now is a good time.
I think you said, Rabbi, earlier in today's share that in Atzilus is not able to reach the Ayin, whereas from the Levana, from Koach Atzmi, from Milamata, from the darkness, we're able to reach Ayin. But if that's correct, I think you said that. But I think we said, but learned earlier that there's Mutfa, Murgash, and Muskal, and that that's in all in Atzilus, and at that level, that when it turns its face, Chachma and Bina in Yichud turns its face to Keser, it is able to access from Atzilus. It is able to access that deep level of Ayin. So how does that coincide?
Because that comes through Avodah. If you go back, you'll see we're talking about Atzilus on its own. In the process of creation, Atzilus is a very high level of Gilui, but there you have the revelation of the divine. But through Avodah, actually, is the Avodah from Bria Yetzirah Asiyah that elevates everything. If you recall, Mudva Murgish Muskel, you elevate from Midas, from Malchus to the Midas, and then the Midas elevate Chachma and Bina, and then everything turns to the Ayin of Keser. So you're correct. That is correct. That's ultimately what Avodah does. It elevates both the lower levels, but it also ultimately reveals also an Oyer in Atzilus, the Etzem, through the Avodah. That's the Avodah that we go through.
So I thought that Avodah was within Atzilus, but you were saying no, it's from lower levels, the lower worlds.
Atzilus doesn't do Avodah. Avodah comes from below. Atzilus is Atzilus. Atzilus is a spiritual world that God created that has a certain level of spirituality in it. Then there's the Avodah that comes from the effort that comes from below. Whoever is doing it, whether it's even the Aves, Markava, that they are Chesed Gur Tiferes of Atzilus, but they did Avodah. They didn't just, they were born and they were a Markava, but then they worked hard at it. So there's Atzilus as it's like anything, is there's creation and there's listen. Adam and Chava were put into a perfect world, Gan Eden. And Elam HaMiluyin Nivra was a complete perfect world. And yet it was through their work was to elevate even the garden. We learned that as well, that the garden should produce a lot more than what just God implanted it with. That's the work that we do in working the land, La'avda L'Shamra, to serve and protect. So there's Seder Shtalshus as God creates it, the Tzimtzum and everything. Then our job is to transform the Tzimtzum. As we transform the concealment, everything gets elevated upward.
Could you?
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Rabbi, could you just talk about all this as relates to the Tzimtzum? I mean,
I'd rather not, because it's not relevant to this discussion right here.
okay.
And I always try to stick to what we're learning here. That's Tzimtzum simply means concealment. We're talking about concealment here, right? So whenever you bring clarity into a world of concealment, you're contending with the Tzimtzum. So you need more than that. I mean, that's essentially the point here, to bring light.
I was just wondering how it relates to the different levels with the Mikra Mishnah, and maybe it's not a question that needs to be answered. Thank you.
So let's continue reading. Now, the line begins, Chulu, Kamesha Kosabe Mokamacher. 10 lines from the bottom of page 1388. V'zeu shekosav Yetzir Eir Ubeira Cheshach. And this is what it says, the one who shaped light and created darkness. So we already learned earlier that Bara, the word of Beriyah, is the word of Cheshach. The word of Yetzirah, even though it's a lower world, it's called Yetzirah. Yetzirah, she shaped light and created darkness. So he's going to now explain the contrast between these two in the context of Talmud and Mishnah, Beriyah and Yetzirah. So he says like this: and isn't Beriyah higher than Yetzirah? So you'd think Atzilus is a great light, Beriyah is the next level of light, and Yetzirah is a lower level of light. And yet we say the opposite. Beriyah he associates with darkness. And Yetzirah, a lower world, he associates with light. So he explains, Achi anisenes. However, he anisenes, that's exactly the case. The Beriyah, Chabad, that the world of Beriyah, in a sense, means that's exactly the point. That Beriyah, because they're Chabad, which means intellect, the intellect of Talmud. With Talmud, we're using our minds to understand. Because it's coming from a level of Chabad, it's a state of darkness and concealment. Because Chabad of Atzilus, and Atzilus, where it's radiating Chabad, it doesn't have the capacity, it's not in the realm or domain of an actual gili, literal gili in biyah. It needs to be concealed because it's coming from a very powerful place. But now we qualified. What are we talking about Chabad? What's Chabad? Didn't we learn that Chabad is Mikra, the written Torah? So he says, V'hagam she'atalmud hu Chabad nihi. So we learned earlier, and this takes us back to page 13. Let me just tell you where it is exactly. Page 1365. So he says that even though Talmud is not just Chabad, it's Chabad of Nihi. So let me explain what we learned back there to understand this. Makol Mokum, let me read the end of parentheses, then I'll explain. Nevertheless, Shorshe b'chinas Chabad Atzmon. Its root is in Chabad itself. Commission is bar li'il, as was explained earlier. So again, very brief and dense, and you have to rely on what he said earlier to understand what he means here. So you may recall back then he asked a contradiction, that in some Kabbalah, some places in Kabbalah, it says that Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, is Chabad, Chagas, Nihi of Atzilus, in that order, respectively. Mikra is Chabad, because it has the highest level of divine intelligence. However, before I say that, however, Chagas is Mishnah, and Nihi is Talmud. But then it says elsewhere, seems to be the reverse, that Talmud is Beriyah, Mishnah is Yetzirah, and Talmud and Mikra is Asiyah. He asked this question back on 1365. 1365. So he explained, and this is from a mimer from the Alter Rebbe, from the Tzemach Tzedek. So he explained that it's interdependent, because that which comes from a higher place descends to a lower world. So being that Chabad of Atzilus is the root of Mikra, it goes down and comes, because it's such a powerful revelation, all we can get from it is the Nihi of the Chabad, which comes into the world of Asiyah in simple stories. That's why the written Torah is simple stories. The mitzvahs are just stated in brief, without elaboration, without explanations, without details. Mishnah, which comes from Chagas, the second higher level, so that can go further. It can go all the way into Asiyah, into like those simple stories, the basic mitzvahs. So it goes into the world of Mishnah, where you have somewhat of an elaboration, and that's Chagas, going into Yetzirah, Gilui. Talmud, even though from our point of view, Talmud is the one that explains it most, but from a point of divine revelation, the Talmud doesn't have the clarity in divine revelation as the Mikra, as the written Torah does. So it comes from Nihi, but the Chabad of Nihi. Because remember, Talmud, in contrast to Mikra, requires Chabad, it requires the mind to understand. But this is the Chabad that we can relate to, not Chabad of godliness. The Chabad of Mikra remains removed, and that's why only you have an Asiyah. It only manifests in Asiyah. The Chabad of Nihi, of Atzilus, meaning the lowest level of Atzilus, but there that intellect ends up in Talmud. So Talmud has on one hand human comprehension, we can understand it more than you can Mishnah and Mikra, but on the other hand, it doesn't have the same level of divine, qualitative divine revelation, precisely for that reason. So it reaches more the etzem, the ayin, yes, but not the gilui. That's what he's essentially saying. So Talmud has, that's what he's saying right here, to go back to the parentheses, that even though Talmud is Chabad of Nihi, but its root is a Chabad itself, so it has an element of a Chabad, and therefore, when it comes into the world of Beriyah, it doesn't have the intensity that's there in Atzilus. So there's a element of concealment, but then we use our minds to try to bring light into the world of Beriyah. But on its own, it's a darker state. Mishnah, on the other hand, Mashenkin Chagas Atzilus, Chagas of Atzilus, Yochel is already, Chagas, remember, Mides relate already to another. It's a relationship with existence. So Yochel is B'chinas Gili. That can manifest in the Gili. So in other words, when we say that something is dark or concealed and something is revealed, doesn't always mean it's a lower level. It's precisely because the Talmud has an element of Chabad in it, that's why it's more concealed. And it's precisely because the Mishnah has an element that's not Chabad, Chagas, that's more revealed, that's why it's revealed. So even though Beriyah, the world of Beriyah is higher than the world of Yetzirah, that's exactly why it's a state of concealment still. So I know it could sound a little confusing, but essentially it means that a higher level of revelation is going to be initially concealed, and a lower level of revelation is going to be more revealed. Then comes obviously the work that we're going to discuss a little later. That's what he's saying right now in the context of how could you say that Beriyah Bara Cheshach and Yetzirah when Beriyah is higher than Yetzirah. So he's explaining, Ukamoi, Godel B'Yeser, like a very powerful flame, a very powerful light, I should say. Ef Shalires, you can't see it. You can't see it unless you have a shaded glass. You have a translucent glass, not a transparent one. Try to look at the sun in full brightness. You can't look at it. You need to have shades to look at the sun. A more diminished light, you can look at directly. So what do you see from this? That the greater the light that's in there, the more darkness there's going to need to be able to see it. Ukanal be'inyan ve'era be'elam habriya b'bchinas aspaklaya she'ena me'ira. Like we learned before by ve'era that when he asked the question, let's refer back. He said it back where did he say it? By Moshe. At the bottom of page 1386, he brought the Gemara. The Gemara asks a contradiction. In one verse it says, look at the bottom of 1386. Ve'eres Adnai. And he showed me, and I saw the level of Adnai. And then it says, Kilo yironi odem v'chai. Moshe, the same Moshe says, no person can see me, God says, and live. So did he show it to him? Did he see it? Did he not see? So the Gemara answers, the Gemara says, the difference depends how he looked. Kan bespaklari ha'me'ira, with aspaklari ha'me'ira, with a transparent glass, you cannot see God and live. With a aspaklari she'ena me'ira, a translucent glass that's more shaded and clouded, you could see. So in other words, the greater the light, the only way to actually experience it is through some form of shade, through some form of concealment. When it's shining in its brightness, you can't see it in its full glory. So that's what he's bringing here. But a light that's not that great. It's not that great, then you can look at it directly and see it even through a transparent glass. So in other words, being that Talmud is coming from Chachma, from Chabad, even though Chabad of Nehi, but it's also Chabad, meaning that ultimately there's the ability to really it comes from a level of high revelation from Atzilus. That's why it comes into the world of Beriyah, and that's why it's concealed. Being that Mishnah comes from a lower level in Atzilus, Chagas, which already associates with the relationship with another, so the light is not as powerful. That's why you can see it, and that's why there's a Gilu. So again, this is paradoxical, that the higher the Gilu, the more concealment there is, and the lower the Gilu, the more revelation there is. So Mishnah, in this context, has something that the Talmud doesn't have. It's more revealed, more clarity, but it's from a level that's a lower level in Atzilus, and the Talmud is rooted in a higher level, and that's why initially it comes in a dark place, Beriyah. This needs more elaboration, absolutely, but this is so far what he said here. I want to read further to be able to explain properly what is going on here, because what's bothering me is what's going on here. 1 second. You said Talmud, through the exertion, you reach the ayin of Kesser higher than Chachma. Now he's saying it's coming from Chabad, and Chabad is a higher level than Chagas, which, how does that fit in here? It would seem that Talmud is lower than Mishnah because it's explaining the Mishnah. But I believe what he wants to say is that in Mishnah, you don't need as much, the Tanoim did not need as much exertion with their minds as in Talmud, because they received that from their teachers. That's what I think he's trying to say, but he doesn't say it explicitly, so I want to reserve any conclusive statement on this. But suffice it to say that he's explaining why Beriyah is higher than Yetzirah, but it still relates more, it's more concealed than Yetzirah is, because revelation is dependent on our being able to see it. And it's a higher level, you can't see it directly. That's what he's saying so far.
Could you extend that to Meforshim in Gemara, or breaks apart at that point?
I don't know. I would want to wait to see how he concludes this before we go further. In other words, let's say in our generation today, when we exert ourselves in trying to understand Torah, obviously we don't have the same level of understanding as they had in the times of the Talmud. So can you say that we exert ourselves so we reach even deeper level? Logically, based on the logic that he's using here, it seems like that's the case. But he hasn't said it explicitly, so I don't want to say it either. And because there's also a point the other way around, that even with exertion, will we ever achieve that which the Talmudic scholars achieved? See, so there's a point where it's so concealed that we may not be able to reach there on our own. So I'm not sure about this. Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, and what happens in later generations. He did mention, if you remember, at the bottom of page 1385, he did say, in the name of the Alter Rebbe, that all the Machabim, all the authors, till the Taz and Shach, composed their works with Ruach HaKodesh. And Ruach HaKodesh, he said, is they reveal the Helam of Chochmah. That he did say. So clearly, there is that element there.
But that's in a level of Metzias or Mahus, because it's they're at that point. And what are we talking about? Metzias and Mahus when we talk about what we're learning.
Well, there's no question that we are dealing with Metzias, not Mahus. That's why you can reach the deeper levels. Like if I were to offer you two options, you can see directly godliness, but it's going to be a lower level of godliness because no one can see him and live. Or I could tell you the story about godliness that's even a higher than what you can see with your eyes.
Wait a minute.
Which one would you choose? Again, you could see it directly, but it will be a lower level. Or you won't see it directly, you'll only hear the story of it, but you'll hear the story of a deeper, higher level.
Personally, I'd like to, I would love to have a Mahus at any level.
Okay, but the truth is, in any journey, in any proper journey, you really want both. Like right now, let's say the Mahus of something we all can get on a certain level. You definitely want to master that. But at the same time, as you climb the mountain, you also want to be able to get a taste of what's to come that right now is not Mahus, is only Metzias. You only know about it. And then as you grow, you begin, that also becomes Mahus. And then meanwhile, there's a new level that's revealed that's Metzias. In other words, the journey of the intellectual process of growth is always going to be that you first know about it, that's Metzias. Then you internalize it to the point where it becomes something as if it's like second nature to you. as if you see it with your own eyes. It's so clear. And then new levels get revealed that you don't yet get. So it's a constant Mahus Mitzias experience. You see what I'm saying? The Mahus of the lower level, and then you discover the Mitzias of a higher level. Then you get the Mahus of the higher level, and you discover the Mitzias of yet another higher level. I mean, how, like science, there are things that we once didn't even know we didn't know. Then we discovered things that we know we don't know, and there are things we know we know. In other words, it all comes down to as the horizons expand, you get to see there's a lot more. I don't know what's out there, but I know there's a lot more down that rabbit hole. And then there are things that you begin to really experience. I mean, in many ways, when you hear scientists talk about quantum mechanics and some of the deeper levels of physics, theoretical physics, they talk about it like Mitzias, not Mahus. They say we know there's a fact like this, but we can't understand its personality because we relate to things that are very deterministic, that are very defined. Like everyone understands the Mahus of Elam Hazeh. Very straightforward. A good piece of steak, money, other things that are very tangible and empirical, and you can contain it with your five senses. You experience it with your sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. I saw it with my own eyes. When it comes to the spiritual, it's more mitzias. You know it exists. But then when you grow spiritually, spirituality also starts becoming mohus, mahu. And you start experiencing spirituality with the same type of resonance as you do physicality. And the journey never ends. It's a continuous process. Well, what person is mitzias for another person could be mohus, and vice versa. That all comes down to the level of growth the place what level of consciousness you have reached or achieved. Let me just read a few more lines. Let me continue here. So he says like this. Okay. So we've established now that the higher the revelation, the more it needs to come down in a concealed form, because we can't experience it in its full intensity. Now you would think, based on this, that Yetzirah is inferior to Beriyah, because yes, there's Gilui, but it's of a lower level. That's why you can see it. In Beriyah, it's not as revealed, it's concealed, but it's of a higher level. He's saying no. Nevertheless, there's a quality in Gilui, even if it's a lower level. There's Gilui. There's a quality in the level in the fact that it's revealed. So each one has something that the other doesn't have. And this is critical because at the end of the day, we know Mishnah is a higher level than Talmud. And yet we're saying Talmud has something in it that remains concealed because it's coming from an even higher level. So we'll get to that, how to reconcile that. But meanwhile, there's a Mila in Gili. I just want to see if we should continue reading or it's just going to confuse matters right now. Yeah, I think we'll stop here because the next piece is going to continue to explain and develop this, but it's going to require some more explanation. It's more than just reading a few lines. So I'll reserve that for tomorrow. At the end of the day, just keep in mind that both are necessary. And as I said, the process of teaching, for example, a good teacher will always, what they call megala tefach machaset fachayim. You reveal 1 inch and you conceal 2. What does that mean? That a good teacher, if they only teach something that's concealed, then they're not teaching anything. Then the student will not have any clarity at all. So you reveal enough to be able to be absorbed by the student. So a good teacher is able to assess the containers and the level of the student to be able to make sure the idea is conveyed the proper way, not overwhelming the student and not underwhelming the student. But you always remain, something always has to remain above your head. A good teacher will always make sure that you understand that this idea that you're getting has more to it. So you may not at this point not only know the metzias that there's more to it, not the muhus, but you need the balance of both. If you just leave a student wanting and feeling there's more and I didn't get anything, you haven't succeeded. If you leave the student only getting it and not understanding there's more to it, you also haven't really fully succeeded. So it's a very delicate dance and balance of being able to do that. That's exactly what means a proper education, proper inspiration. Relationships are based on this. The give and take of a proper flow. Just like we talk about the heartbeat. A healthy heartbeat is a wave. Contraction, expansion, not too high peaks and not too low, deep valleys. You need a balanced, smooth flow, but it's pulsating like Rotzev Veshuv, tension and resolution, that there's amount that you are able to resolve and relate to. And then there's always that something remains somewhat elusive and beyond you. And any good relationship, that's the key that makes it to the magic of the balance between two entities. If it's just too blissful and just pure, like a flat line, or just there's no tension at all, there won't be growth. If there's too much tension and not enough internalization and relating to something, obviously is also not going to be motivating and growthful. So you really need a constant process of both white space and black space, so to speak. Like the letters on the page, but there has to be enough white space to be able to read the letters. You can't go too quickly, you can't go too slowly. So this process is essentially what we're addressing here in different language of light and darkness in that sense. So it's not a darkness as in, we're not talking about now oppression, darkness, oppressive darkness. We're talking about a darkness as not everything is revealed because it's such a higher state. So Beriyah is a higher state, so there's an element of concealment there. Yetzirah is a lower state, but there's an element of revelation. And revelation, as we're going to learn, is critical. Because we don't want to just have things concealed, even as they're the highest levels. We want ultimately everything to be revealed. So we're going to have to go back and forth in doing this, in understanding the value of the sun, the value of the stones, the luminous stones, and the value of the moon, each one playing a different role in this context. But we'll get to that as we continue learning. As I said, in the last few pages, it's very evident and very obvious that the Rebbe Rashab has gone into a very dense type of writing. He's writing, I would say, almost I don't say short notes, but very briefly. Earlier pages, we saw there were pages where he really elaborated a lot. So though he's writing a lot here, but every idea is very concentrated. That's why I'm going much slower and trying to elaborate on every one of these, unpacking it properly. Okay, any questions? So I think this class, I at least I feel more comfortable saying that it's becoming a little clearer, the ideas. Still more to go, but we're getting there. Okay, so we'll stop here at the bottom, 4 lines from the bottom of page 1380.